let me open the Q&A part. So please, Professor Lee.
I would like to ask one question.
We have microphone. We have microphone, please. Thank you.
One question first. How did you measure degree of risk aversion of women and men? Is it an experiment or you sit in the board? I don't know. And one comment, if indeed, by the way, my first sentence, very interesting topic to begin with. Now, if indeed women take more risk, and therefore you show that the rate of return is increasing as a result, does it mean when you have a crisis like 2008, they are responsible for the crisis too? And I love women. Thank you.
Okay. All right, very good questions. Okay, so the measurement, so we had two measures, and both of them are very simple. Okay, so I want to preface that we're not doing anything fancy here because if you can manage to figure out how to get directors to do an experiment, let me know. Right, so we have very simple survey questions, and so the security question is basically, I would argue, a measure of risk aversion that comes from the Schwartz Human Value Survey, and so that's sort of a standard survey design. And then the second measure of risk aversion is a typical lottery question, which has been used in the German SOEP survey. And so our point was basically, like, if you take standard questions that people use to measure risk aversion, basically one of our points is that the sign flips when you go to the board versus the population. Okay, so in the population, for example, if you look at the security measure, so you can look at the World Value Survey, also has this Schwartz Human Value Surveys, and if you look at the, in the population, women are more security oriented in the population than men, but then you look at the board, it's the opposite. Women are less security oriented than the men. And so part of our whole point is that, even using standard measures of risk aversion, which are not very sophisticated, right? But our point is that the sign can flip, and so we can't generalize from the population. Now the second point, exactly, so I actually have a paper called Lehman Sisters, and the whole point of the paper is based around this idea. So I don't know how many of you know, but the Lehman Sisters hypothesis is that if only we'd had more women on boards of banks, there would not have been a financial crisis. And so my paper says, well, that's bogus. Right? Because women on the boards of financials, I showed you those graphs, right? If anything, they are less risk averse than the men. So of course you can still have a financial crisis with the women, right? But now the problem is we don't really know how these preferences manifest themselves, right? So if you think about boards or decision teams, okay, so maybe the women are more risk averse or less risk averse than the men, right? But how does a team as a whole make decisions? We don't have the first clue, right? And so part of our point is to argue that, well, first, people don't understand selection, right? So the women who go into finance, they're not like the people who take no risk in their careers, right? Because there are fewer women in finance than there are in other fields, and so of course you've got to be a risk taker as a woman to overcome all the hurdles that you have to overcome, right? So what we think is people are not thinking about this the right way, right? So if you make these arguments that, well, if we had more women on the boards, then the financial crisis wouldn't have happened, well, I think that's a bogus argument, right? Because people don't understand selection. Now, is it okay to say that if there had been more women on boards, a crisis could have happened? Like equal opportunity, I would say. If men can start a crisis, why can't women start a crisis, right? Why should the men have all the glory to themselves, right?
Okay, next question.
There's a couple of pieces of work I've been involved with in which we failed to find strong effects for the benefit of women on boards, and we thought maybe this was something peculiar with the circumstances we've been looking at. So we'd been looking at banks in Vietnam, and we've been looking at microfinance institutions in South Asia. And we thought, maybe it's because the women on boards are just token women on boards and have been shoveled there to give a pretense of gender diversity. Now, what you seem to be suggesting is that, in fact, our findings were actually quite valid and we didn't need to actually construct anything complicated to try and explain that.
Yeah, so Exactly. So, I mean, of course, there is a token argument, right? So how do you rule that out? It's difficult, right? Because people always say, well, it's the token, right? But, you know, I guess if you look at my results and you say, well, look, the women seem to be stronger than the men, right? So the women are more self-directed. They're more risk takers than, I mean, are those really tokens? I don't know. I would imagine the tokens would look different. Right, so I think the stories we have to tell should be much more complicated, right? So it's very easy to throw out your results and say it's just because of women are tokens, but I think there's a lot more going on. Now, of course, anytime you look at performance and diversity, so I'm actually of the opinion that you pretty much can't identify any result in the board literature because there's no good natural experiments. You can't actually do experiments. Where are the exogenous instruments? I mean, it's really difficult, right? But I think we have to understand that identification is very difficult and hence not overinterpret our results. And so yes, I would argue that those are perfectly valid results and they should be published as non-results because that's important.
Professor Adams, now the study makes important, interesting differences between men and women, and it seems to me that it then goes on to assume that more than 50% of the global human population is homogeneous.
Sorry, what was it?
The paper makes interesting distinctions between men and women, and then it seems to me that paper assumes that 50% of global population is homogeneous. In other words, women are homogeneous in the study.
I think you are referring to homogeneous.
Well, homogeneous. Oh,
homogeneous,
referring to cultural differences, maybe, right?
Yes.
So you're saying I'm lumping women and men into homogeneous categories?
Does the study distinguish between different characteristics of women themselves? Now we compare men and women, and then focus on women as a homogeneous sample.
Oh, so of course women can also be very different from each other, right? I don't know if you're familiar with the, let's see, what is it called? There's this hypothesis that you need at least 3 women on a board in order to achieve anything, right? And so I'm sort of like, well, you know, like personally all I think is you need at least 1, and 1 woman can already change everything. This idea that you need at least 3 sort of assumes that the women are all the same and they're going to agree, right? So I always get very upset because I'm like, you know, nobody tells me who I'm going to agree with and who I'm going to disagree with. I reserve the right to disagree with everyone regardless of gender, right? So of course women can be very different from each other, and I think this is another stereotyping thing that is going on, and we need much more work on this, right? So I think it's actually very interesting to say, well, let's just take the women, how different are they? And you might imagine there could be more dispersion in characteristics than among the men, I don't know, right? It's an interesting question.
Okay, next question.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
So, culture, right? I think all this is cultural. I don't think that it's the DNA of men and women that is so much different that makes one something else than the other. So your results are consistent with the cultural issues as well. So, for example, in certain cultures, men are expected to take risks in smaller decisions, but when it comes to the big decisions, they're supposed to offer safety, right? So I'm just saying, and because culture, all these things are cultural, what you expect of men and women, starting from when they play with dolls and balls and whatever. So what is the influence of culture in all this work? And one minor question, did you mean more, did you mean risk-seeking or less risk-averse? Because you used the...
Yeah, so sometimes I'm a bit sloppy in my, when I talk, because also I keep on mixing up the risk aversion and the less risk averse.
Okay.
Yeah, so no, I meant less risk averse or more risk averse, not risk seeking.
Okay.
Yeah.
And about culture?
Yeah, so a very good question and very important question, right? So I think this is a very deep and fundamental question that we don't yet understand, right? And there's a lot of work on this. So for example, I showed you those graphs with the STEM fields, right? One argument that people make about why women don't go into STEM is math, right? So there's this idea that women don't do as well as, or girls don't do as well as boys in standard math tests. So is this culture or is this genetic, right? So this is like a huge, huge debate, and it's not settled. And so I think this is a very important debate, and we need to understand this more. So I think part of the point is we can't assume too much, right? So we don't know very much. And so actually, so speaking of culture, so the survey I showed you was done in Sweden. Now Sweden is famous for being gender equal. Okay, so this is very interesting. So I showed you that in a very gender equal society, the women have substantially different characteristics than the men in ways that are unexpected, right? So like security orientation. So the women take or are less risk averse than the men in a gender equal society. So this is sort of interesting because you might say, well, maybe they're the same in a gender equal society. Well, in our sample, they're not exactly the same, right? Another interesting thing is you might say, well, suppose we were not in Sweden, what would I expect? I would actually expect the differences to be much bigger if we're not in Sweden, precisely because Sweden is a gender equal society. So the selection to get into the board is much easier in Sweden. Now, suppose you're in the US, or I don't know how the Czech Republic is in terms of women on boards, but suppose you're in a country where it's really hard to get on the board. Well, then I would imagine you have to take a lot of risk in order to be, so if you compare to men then who don't have to take much risk to get there, I would say the differences would be bigger. So I think we don't yet really know the role of culture in all of this.
I was thinking, if I may, I was thinking that in genetics, you wouldn't expect a lot of correlation between whether, maths and boys and maths and girls. I still think it's something other. And of course, you're here to prove that they are wrong, because if I'm not wrong, you studied mathematics as well?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So I wouldn't expect that there are more men that are better in mathematics than women. Maybe it is self-selection, and it's again the cultural thing. So I really appreciate your response, and you gave me a lot of food for thought to work on.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so it's a very interesting topic. I was at this presentation the other day by a neuroscientist who wrote a book called The Gendered Brain. And so neuroscientists are now starting to scratch the surface, and there's a lot of opinions in the area, but this issue of whether the brains of men and women are really different, it's very complicated, right? And so this was a very good neuroscientist who actually argued that if society is gendered, that can induce changes in the brain. And so, where is the causality here? We don't really know, right? So, like some people have the story that women, they're not intrinsically, for some reason, able to do math. Well, all you have to do is say, look at cross-country variation. So in some countries, the women do better on math than the men. So is it genetics or is it culture, right? It's not so obvious.
Okay, next question, please.
Hi, thanks for the presentation and thanks for the pictures, got nice ones. I was just wondering, you talked about the selection of the women.
There was a question in the back.
We're talking about the selection of women together. That's me.
Sorry. Oh, okay, sorry.
Sorry,
I was looking in the back, so I was confused.
Yeah, so you were talking about the selection of women to enter the board. I'm just thinking that it's more complicated for women to be directors. Basically, it's more difficult to enter the sector. So I was just wondering if you could control for that or look into that. For instance, you can look at the number of graduates. Women graduate in finance and what the proportion accessing a board position. And because that's evolving over time, you can find how actually the changes in this accessibility of the board impact the impact of women on board. But then you have kind of a variation that may explain a bit why women behave differently, because otherwise you have a very tiny proportion of the population that may be quite different, because just these women are just the best of the promotion or the most looking for risks, for instance. Another question is, based on your classification of superheroes, do you believe that Deadpool is a superhero or not?
Yeah, well, that's
good question.
That's a good question, right? So, people say he's a superhero, so I guess, not all superheroes, there's probably diversity among superheroes, right? Also, so, I would say maybe is he benevolent? Not really. Does he care about society? Not really. Yeah, he's self-directed, right? Does he care about power? Maybe not, right? So so I would say that not all superheroes are exactly the same, But the question about, so looking at the selection issue, if you know a good way to do this right? So like this is sort of like what we want to see is let's take the population and let's say who becomes a director, who advances through the ranks. It's hard to do these studies because we don't have good data, right? And so, that's really, So we tried to get a little bit close to that. It's not very close at all, but what we did is we looked at countries and we said, well, what are the macro factors that are related to the representation of women in the director pool? So what we said is, how many directors are there in a country? And how many of those unique directors are female? So we said, let's not look at this at the firm level, let's look at it at the country level. And then what we showed is that full-time female labor force participation is correlated with the representation of women in the director pool. Okay, so why is that interesting? Well, basically we're saying that countries where women have the ability to stay in the workforce are gonna have more women serving as directors, right? And which sort of makes sense because you're like, well, they have all the skills. It's also sort of important from a policy perspective because everyone's talking about flex time. Right? Everyone's like, oh, well, all we need to do is we need to make sure that women can stay at home and also, juggle this. But, honestly, when it comes to a decision-making position, it's not going to cut it, right? Because, in comparison to the men, you're always going to look worse. And so basically, so understanding what are the factors that help women get into decision-making positions is, really, if you're interested in research in this area, my God, it's so many questions.
I want to follow a little bit on the culture questions. You used the Schwartz human values model, as I saw, which is a very good model to describe culture on an individual level. But as the two gentlemen before said, also the collective, let's say, unconscious of the countries also matter. For example, we have the Hofstad model, which is more on a country-based analysis, which shows that one country from the other differs greatly, and this collective unconscious shapes the whole behavior of the people. So I think it will be a good idea if you try to employ or to find countries which is opposite in the indexes, in the cultural dimensions of Hofstad, especially in the masculinity, femininity dimension or in power distance, and see what are the differences in your findings. Because Sweden has some certain collective unconscious, for example, it's a very egalitarian culture. I think that India, for example, is not the same like Sweden, or even US is not the same like Sweden. So I think you could benefit at least for the first part of your analysis, for the superhero part, despite I don't doubt it. I think that women, they are superheroes. If you add also some country level specifics in your analysis, because they shape unconsciously the behavior of people in this society and cannot be captured by the Schwartz model. Also have in mind that even if I remember correctly from Schwartz, it is pointed that many of the Schwartz dimensions correlate one with the other. So when you find one dimension there are familiar dimensions that have a huge correlation among them. So it's not very independent one from the other, like in other models. Okay, this I have to point. I don't know if I helped.
Yeah, no, I mean, the point is well taken. So ideally, you want to do this in as many countries as possible. It's not easy to do these studies, right? So you have to remember, we're surveying directors, right? So access is very difficult, right? But we have recently, my co-author and I, we've done a study where I think we have directors from 20 countries. And so the point of that paper is different, but we're going to do a gender paper also using that data. And so I hope to get at exactly these issues of what's the role of culture in trying to understand value differences between men and women. The point about the Schwartz model, sure, there could be correlations. One thing that's nice about using the Schwartz model is that the Schwartz model has been used to study the population. So there's many papers looking at differences between men and women across cultures using Schwartz. And so if you now use a model that's been used for the population to look at so decision makers, so people in different positions, then you can really highlight sort of the contrast between what we think about women in the population and what women in decision-making positions really look like, and you see they're totally different. And they're different in unexpected ways based on the population characteristics. Of course, it'd be useful to also look at other models. So I'm not saying this is the be-all and end-all, but that's one reason why it's really interesting to use the Schwartz models, is because you also can compare to the population. So.
Okay, next question.
Just to make the point that women are maybe a little bit different, they always tend to ask the last questions, or some of the last questions, and they were the first ones. So I was wondering if some of this research that many of us might want to engage in related to the boards may be informed in some way by research on women in leadership positions, say as CEOs, or perhaps in politics or in academia or something else that might help us inform the choice of research that we want to do.
Yeah, so I think all of these areas relate to each other, right? And I think it's sort of an interesting question. Like, how do we think? One interesting question is, should we have policies that target boards, right? So like the way a lot of this framework. A lot of this policy discussion is sort of like, oh my God, there's few women on boards, so this is basically the policymaker, right? Oh my God, there's few women on boards, we've got to do something. It's the firm's fault because they're not hiring women, we've got to have a quota, okay? But now, if you think about it, if you have a quota for women on boards, maybe women are being directed away from positions in politics, right? Or maybe they don't become an academic because they're now going on the board. So I think these things are all related. It's very interesting.
Oh, they don't make it as a CEO to many of the companies.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think all of these things are related, and I just think there's so much research to be done because honestly, I think we haven't even scratched the surface yet. And linking these things, like one reason, CEOs is always a bit tricky because there's what, like 4? Can you write a paper about 4 CEOs? I mean, people do, and I'm always like, my God, you only have like 4 people, like outliers, like, but like, so there's sometimes not enough women to be able to study the issue. But a lot of the conceptual ideas are sort of overlapping, and I think very important. Yeah.
So last 2 questions, please. Yeah, you can.
I have a question on selection. So throughout the presentation, you talk about women in boards, but not about women, of course. I think one way about getting a metric how important selection is in the data you have, look at the difference between men and women in the boards and in the population. And then take that difference in difference. I think men in the boards are different from men in the population, but women in boards are more different than women in population. And that difference, I think, is a perfect metric of selection.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's actually, so I didn't show you the full paper.
Ah, okay.
But that's exactly what we do.
Sorry.
Yeah, which is, yes, thank you. It's, yeah, because that's cool, right? So you compare to the population, and so basically what we show, so for example, like in the population, women are always more tradition-oriented than men, okay? Which makes sense if you think that the average woman stays at home. It doesn't work, right? Okay, now you get to the board level. Now what we can show is men on the board are less tradition-oriented than men in the population. Makes sense, right? Women on the board are less tradition-oriented than women in the population. But if you show the graph, I don't have the picture, but if you look at the graph, it's just like women on the board, basically it's off the charts, right? So there's so much less tradition-oriented than the woman in the population that when you then compare men and women on the board, the women are much less tradition-oriented than the men. Okay, so basically you go from women in the population being more tradition-oriented than men to on the board, they're less tradition-oriented.
But that means it's all selection, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So I think it's all selection. And of course it'd be cool to be able to understand the selection better, right? But my view, it's all selection, and that's why, when people make these arguments, for example, if we'd had more women on the boards of banks, the crisis wouldn't have happened. I'm like, well, these people don't understand selection, right?
So the last question.
Thank you, Renée. Brilliant, brilliant presentation first. So I'm thinking about in enhancing our knowledge about women involvement in the board. One of the ideas that jumped in my head while you're presenting is to think about who's the gatekeeper. How do we choose board members? And does it vary from company to another? And you can look at it, does it vary from country to country? Maybe this will provide or improve our understanding of what's happening.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's great. Edith, where's Edith? Is Edith here? Yeah, there's some great new research arguing that one thing that these quota, like these board policies do, they change the way that directors are recruited. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done there because we don't understand it. Of course, like the data challenges, right, are substantial, right? But I totally agree, like how directors are recruited. Actually, we don't even know how men are recruited. You know, like a lot of these things, you know, it's not a gender issue. A lot of these things we just have no clue, right? So we don't know what the preferences of board members are. We don't know how they interact with each other. We don't really have the first clue about men or women on the boards. And how they get chosen, how they get their positions, and these are all like fantastic research issues, right? Because if we believe that leadership matters, we need to understand this better, right? And you know, obviously I'm exaggerating, but of course we have a lot of research on boards, right? But I think we still have so much more work to do, which is really great because you know, we all need to write papers, right? So
we have one superhero. Last question.
Thank you for your illuminating presentation. I have a very small comment, not on a presentation, it's a general one. I think there isn't necessarily a link between math, gender, and finance. And we can go back to Keynes to look at it. He said many years ago that the good speculator is the one who guesses well what the average opinion thinks that the average opinion will think. That doesn't require math.
So I think that's a good way to end the session.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. So as this is the last chance to see you all in one room, I would like to thank you for your participation in the conference. I would like to thank the faculty for the support. Thank to my two chairs, Emilios and Magnus. And I would like to thank my conference team, 5 nearest people who helped me a lot. 4 of them were women superheroes, so I'm glad to see you all at the conference. Thank you very much.